Pleasure to be here, and this is such an important topic, and I'm more than happy to get started on this academic panel by saying a few words about a theme that has emerged with a good deal of work that we've been doing at the Wharton Risk Management and Decision Process Center, and you'll hear a little bit more about that from Carolyn Kuski a little later on. And this is on addressing biases in dealing with climate disruption and utilizing the behavioral risk audit. Now, let me give you an idea as to why, and Eric wanted me to say a little bit about this to start at least my presentation. I had never been involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change until the AR5, and I was asked to co-lead the chapter on integrated risk and uncertainty assessment of climate change. And it was a very interesting experience for me personally, because we had a wonderful group of people who really chimed in from both the point of view of the challenges we face in dealing with uncertainty and ways to address it. And what we did in that particular chapter, it's available, it's on the AR5, this was released about a year and a half ago, was we decided that it would be useful to have a framework with respect to how we could address this problem by looking first at the challenges we face with climate change, with the tremendous amount of uncertainty that exists, although there's a lot of consensus, as we also recognize with respect to that. And by the way, if our panelists, since we are using PowerPoints, it seems to make sense for everyone to at least take a seat, as Eric has done, and I'll go through this. And I'm going to try to be fairly brief so we leave enough time for questions and discussion, since there are 5 or 6 of us on this panel. What we did was we adopted the framework, and many of you may be familiar with the book that Daniel Kahneman wrote, Thinking Fast and Slow. How many people are familiar, just so I get an idea of that? A number of you. And it's a really fascinating book, and we decided to adopt that as the theme of our chapter, to talk about the fact that there's a lot of intuitive thinking, and I'll talk about that in a moment in terms of what I mean by intuitive thinking, and that you need to think more deliberatively and more systematically using the tools of decision analysis and cost-benefit analysis and normative analysis. We try to put those two things together to think about what we could suggest in the way of prescriptions. And that's really what I want to focus on in my few minutes that I have this morning, to talk a bit about how we understand these biases that are prevalent in our world today in terms of not only us as individuals, but decision makers at all levels, whether it be organizations, government, etc. And what was interesting to us was that with the IPCC that has existed since 1980, this was really the first time that the behavioral issues were ever put on the table for them to consider. And so as a result of that, I think we found ourselves in a position of trying to highlight that. And I want to highlight this for the group because I think it's extremely important for us to think about ways that we address these points, and that's what I'm going to do. Now, Eric mentioned, and this is a book my colleague Bob Meyer, who co-directs the Risk Center with me, and I put together. And the reason we did this is we were recognizing we don't do a good job in preparing for these low probability, high consequence events. So I want to highlight a few of the biases that were all discussed in that chapter on climate change in one form or another, and then talk about how we can address them with a behavioral risk audit, and do that really in the few minutes that I have here. So let me highlight the biases. One of the most important ones is myopia. We focus on very short time horizons. And in particular, if you're investing in any measures at all to address climate change, and let's focus on that, there are high costs of doing that, solar being an example, where if you install solar panels, there's a very high cost. And the expected benefits are excellent if you think about the long term of your house. But if you're thinking about it in the next 2 or 3 years or 4 years, you're going to say that this isn't necessarily worth one's while, and we have to address that problem. So myopia is a part of it. The second one, amnesia. We forget the lessons of the past and decide not to undertake protective measures. We bury our heads in the sand, and the little comment on that is we learned about ostriches. And I won't ask you the question, but I can tell you when you ask the question, what do ostriches do? I will ask it. Everyone, including myself, until we learned about it, said they bury their heads in the sand. And the fact of the matter is, they don't. They are extremely smart. They don't have they basically are very fast. They can't fly, so they escape, and they escape by running rapidly. They save their young ones by pretending that they're going to stay, and then they escape the hyenas afterwards. We bury our heads in the sand, and that's why we called it the ostrich paradox, because it's us who do have that role, not necessarily the ostriches. So we forget these lessons of the past. Optimism. We underestimate the likelihood of extreme events because they're below our threshold level of concern. We're not going to worry about climate change because it's not going to happen. The myopia plays a role here. It's not going to happen now, so we tend not to focus on them. Inertia. Very important thing. The status quo bias. And it takes us time and energy to change. There's uncertainty, and we're loss averse, and so we're concerned more about what might happen on the negative side than on the positive, and we stay just where we are. Simplification. We intend to only a few of the relevant factors rather than the whole spectrum. And we may focus on probabilities before a disaster. It's below my threshold level of concern. We'll focus on worst case scenarios after a disaster when it happens, and we don't think about the probabilities. Go in one extreme or the other on our decision-making process. And finally, herding. We look to our neighbors. We look to our friends. What are they doing? We look to other corporations. What are they doing? Other firms. And the challenge is that if they may not be making decisions in a very systematic way, and we agree, and we won't make those decisions either that way. And as a result, we have a major challenge on that. So those are 6 biases that we describe in the book. And what I want to do, and I'm going to do it very briefly, is highlight some remedies for dealing with those problems that came out of at least the work that we did and we're proposing. And so the big point of the book is to say we got these things. We're not going to change these biases. They are part of the way we deal with the world. And I can mention just one example on insurance, and Carolyn Kuski will talk a little bit more about that on insurance and the role it plays. The insurance industry never paid attention to terrorism coverage before 9/11. They never charged a penny for it before 9/11, even though there was the Oklahoma City disaster and World Trade Center, 1993. After 9/11, they didn't offer coverage. They said it was too risky. So you went from one extreme to another. So it isn't just us, and all of us do that. And I bought my first set of battery cables after my car didn't start, not before. So, we are all victims of that. So myopia, how do we deal with this? Well, let me use solar energy as an example. If you can get an upfront, if the solar company pays an upfront cost for that solar panels on your house, gives you a long-term loan, and the savings on your electricity every year are greater than the cost of the loan, this is attractive for you financially. So stretch the time horizon by stretch the upfront cost over time. A very simple example, but it could be done, and some companies in California are doing precisely that. Amnesia. We forget, essentially, then we cancel our insurance policy. We've sort of advocated and talking with the industry about multi-year insurance policies rather than having it canceled on you if you have a loss, or you're canceling yourself because you haven't collected on your policy. People feeling, God, I've wasted my money. Optimism. Stretch the time horizon. Tell everyone that instead of a 1 in 100 chance of a flood or a hurricane occurring next year, there's at least a 1 in 5 chance of more than one hurricane occurring in the next 25 years. Same probability. Focus on 25 years, people pay attention. We've done a lot of experiments, not just us, but others on that aspect. Inertia. Make the insurance, for example, a default option. You get an insurance policy. If you don't like it, cancel it. But putting it as a default option, you'll maintain it, we think, in a way that if you were asked, you won't do it. Simplification. If you're simplifying things and you want to focus on it, focus before the disaster on a worst-case scenario, not afterwards. Get people to think about that, and they'll play a role. And finally, herding. The herding bias is one that we really struggle with, but we were talking last night at dinner about the idea of how are you going to get people to adopt protective measures before disaster, if you could have seals of approval on homes, if you have the LEEDS program that approves that, a home and says that this is a safe home, maybe you'll get others to follow suit because of the fact that they see others are doing it. So establish social norms, and this may be one way to do it by giving people that message. So those are the ideas. I'm not going to, I have more detail on them if it's posted. I'm going to conclude right now with a very, very simple comment. To overcome systematic biases in encouraging deliberative thinking for developing these long-term strategies, reframe the problem, that's the idea, 1 in 5 rather than 1 in 100, and provide short-term incentives. Give people a long-term loan so they see